Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now your hosts, Jackson Mummy and Megan Saya from Celebration Bar Review.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is Wednesday, December 8th, and I am glad to be here. Hope that you are all doing well. Megan is not going to be with me today. June is in the chat box. The OGs are going to take the helm this week. Since Megan is not with me, I am going to take over the news of the bar exam world and some announcements. I'll give you some updates on things. And then I'm going to go to the questions that you all have asked during the week, both study questions and administrative questions. And then, time permitting, I'm going to jump into what I teased you with last week, which was I asked you to send me your toughest bar exam problems, the ones that keep you up at night. And I got a ton of them, way more than I could certainly do right now. But I thought I would take a couple of topics and try and dig into them. So we're going to start today with spousal privilege in criminal law. And then we're going to go to the dreaded Rule Against Perpetuities. There's plenty of material here, so we may do this more frequently, but I want to get Megan in to help because she's obviously the genius here. We'll do our best with that. In any event, that's the plan for today. Let me just start in terms of announcements by talking about group coaching. I want to let you know that our group coaching schedule remains the same for the upcoming week. Bobco will be doing his call at 12 noon Eastern, that's 9 a.m. Pacific on Saturday. Brianna will be doing her call Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. And June will be doing her phone call Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Again, as always, you can find the links in our private Facebook group. Group Coach has their own unique link, and they use that same link all the time. So if you've been on their call before, just use that same link. If for some reason you are not on Facebook or can't find the link, send an email to June at celebrationbarreview.com, and she will be glad to give you the links. So again, Saturday, Monday night, and Tuesday night, encourage all of you to jump on at least one of those calls. They are beginning to fill up, and when we get them full, we will then add more calls, just so everyone knows that. All right, some other important announcements that we want to bring to your attention today. The first is that the National Conference of Bar Examiners has provided us with a brand new 200-question multi-state bar exam. This exam is the first full-length exam released by the NCBE that contains all 7 subjects. So up until this point, we've had OPEs and we've had other things, but we've never had a full 200-question exam with the full range of subjects. We now have that, and we have it along with answer explanations drafted by the National Conference. That material is now available in your course platform. You will find it in Multi-State Workbook 3. That's a brand new book, and you'll find that book under your digital course files, regardless of which course you're in. When you get into I think it's the course walkthrough probably is the initial section, but look for digital course library, and you will see the book there. You can open it up as a PDF. You could download and print it. It's a bit lengthy, I think, to do that. We will be adding the actual assignment of doing that exam over the next week or two. We're actually putting those questions into our online test base called TestMoz, and that will take us a few more days to get that ready. So once we've got that, we'll have the link, and we'll show you that, and it will be later in the course. So no one at this point should be doing that full-length test. I know there are some bar review companies out there telling people to do it right away. I think that's foolish. Don't think you need to do that. So we're going to add it in. We're probably going to substitute it for one of the other full-length tests. So we're not adding the number of hours to your study plan, but we want to get a little better handle on it before we go much further. Megan and her editors have looked at it. We've got it put together. We like the answer explanations from the examiners. They're actually pretty good. I'm encouraged and excited about that. But again, I want to just make clear, if you get a solicitation from the bar examiners to buy this new test, they're calling it the Complete Practice Exam, CPE, I guess. You don't need it. We've got it right here, and we'll have it in an online format, so as well as in the PDF. So that's the status there on the new Practice MBE. We're excited about that. Next thing I wanted to tell you about is something I'm actually excited about that we did it. As we've got a product called Bar Maps. Bar Maps is really a series of 3 different products for all of the subjects of the bar exam. It's a series of timed videos, taking our regular video course and breaking it into timed sections. And then it's got fast finish audios, which are sound compressed of the audio tracks of those lectures. And then the third component are mind maps that we've created in every subject. And we've done that in MindMeister. And that's the software program that we use. Now, I was getting a lot of feedback from people that they were struggling with how to create their own mind map and how to make this work. So we decided to do something a little different. I'm going to show you what we've done here. This is actually in the Bar Maps product, and I happen to be in Real Property. And this is the mind map here. Now, up until this point, it was more challenging to figure out how to edit and work with it. So what we've done, if you scroll down on the page, you'll see that we've added a line that says you can download a PDF and then open it from there. And so here is the download for that particular PDF. You can download it, have a PDF that you could print, work with very easily. If you want to edit your own mind map, as before, click on the link and you can do that. And you will notice that we've added some additional pieces. We've added some new sections, particularly what we're going to talk about today. So you'll have the PDFs, you can download those and you can work with them. I hope that is helpful for people. We've got all of the multi-state mind maps in PDF form. We are in the process of adding the state subjects as well. That takes a bit longer, but we're going there. Next thing I wanted to just talk about that Megan asked me to remind all of you. We are seeing some registration limits from different jurisdictions for the February exams. Notably, we've seen them in DC and Maryland, where they've set a hard number on the number of applicants that are going to be allowed to sit. If for any reason you have not yet applied for the February exam in your jurisdiction, make sure you do that. I think the deadlines are coming, or they've been there. You may have passed in some jurisdictions already, but be very aware of what's going on there. As we've been watching the Omicron variant and the impact of that, clearly it could have some questions and some problems in terms of how to give the exam. And it appears that the standard is going to still remain only an in-person exam everywhere across the country. And so we're not getting any indication of any movement at all on an online test. So assume it's an in-person exam, but make sure that you jump into this and start preparing for this, but not only preparing for it, but just being aware of what the examiners are doing. I honestly don't know what they're going to do if this variant becomes more widespread. Who knows? And literally no one knows. So if anybody's saying that they know, they don't. But as of this moment, the current instruction from the NCBE is an in-person exam only. And I think what some states will do is they'll simply restrict the number of people that can take the exam in order to comply with their state requirements. Last comment I have, last week we didn't do a webinar, and I recorded a video about holidays in the bar exam. If you haven't watched it, I hope you do. It's really, I think, a pretty good one. It's about 20 minutes long. One of you wrote back to me and said, this is probably one of your best videos yet. Thank you for that. And then the student said, I love the strategy that I talked about of quieting the mitote. The mitote is that chaos in your brain. And really what we're talking about is that it's hard to listen and focus and concentrate when there's a lot going on in your head. This time of the year, there's even more going on. Then you add COVID on top of the holidays, on top of the bar exam, and it turns into a full-out piece of chaos. And so in this video, I talk about the importance of quieting that and how you do it, and trying to deal with the internal and external distraction. Mitote is a ancient Toltec word. It means the bazaar. It means where people came together and they were all shouting in different languages to buy and sell goods. That's a pretty good explanation for what goes on in most of our brains most of the time, isn't it? Or at least it's certainly mine. I've got a lot of mitote today. I'm not gonna lie. I'm looking at all these different boxes and all these different things going on. I appreciate you hanging with me while I do that. I want to get to the questions that you sent in the past week. I got a fairly lengthy email from a student today who had a lot of questions. I'm going to break them into separate ones, but they're good ones and I appreciate it. The student said, and this is apparently a retake student, I purchased the photo reading option, but to be honest, I don't find it helps me. Perhaps I'm not doing it correctly. And another student said, in the same vein, over the weekend, I began to have doubts about whether or not I'm doing or applying photo reading correctly because my multiple choice results for the week have not been as good as in weeks prior when I first began photo reading, even though I'm photo reading now more than ever. But then the second student said, I know that I'm doing exactly what I have to in terms of photo reading and my bar studies, but I need to keep the doubting gremlins away. I wanted to address this because this is a time when photo readers tend to get really anxious. You start hearing everything coming from the periphery, the metoda, about studying and memorizing, and you got to bear down, and you got to work harder, and you got to do more stuff. And ultimately, that's not very effective. Photo reading works. It works all the time, and it works whether or not you're doing it properly or not. There's no improper way to do it because it's really dealing with the non-conscious brain and with physiological functions. So there's nothing that you're consciously doing that makes it better or worse. So if you're flipping pages, it's going to the non-conscious. Now, the problem is that is totally unsatisfying to the conscious brain, isn't it? You finish photo reading, you're like, what? I'm sorry, what? There's nothing there. And so you start to get panicky and you start to feel like, oh my God, I spent all that money, I did that time, I don't know anything, it's all gonna go down the crapper. And that's not accurate at all. Photo reading works just fine. You just have to relax and trust it. And what happens for most people is that if they continue to photo read and apply the photo reading activation techniques, things like mind mapping and the lectures and the question practice, that they begin to see improvement in their scores. Now, it's not a straight line up. Sometimes it goes up and down, as the second student indicated, but it gets better and you don't need to panic. Just keep at it and you'll be fine. If you're using selective intuition, and there's a section in your course in which we go into that in some depth in the multi-state, I think it's section 5 or 6 for most of you, do that and you'll start to see the results. And we see these extraordinary results every exam when people just trust and follow the process. When someone says, I'm not doing it correctly, nope, that's not it. You're just not trusting. You're not trusting that you're doing it, and therefore you're resisting it, and that's what gets you into trouble. So my encouragement to that student is keep photo reading, keep doing it, keep following the structure and the approach. And if you have to, go back and listen to some of the activation steps that Paul puts into the course in those first 7 or 8 audio sessions. All right, this student that was struggling with photo reading went on and asked some other questions. I want to get into that. They said, how many hours a week should I be studying? I'm currently studying about 20 to 25 hours. And my studying consists of listening to the lectures and trying to photo read the outlines. And I do MBE questions in the program, and I do an extra 60 to 80 a week in Adaptabar. And I get this a lot from people. Right now, 20 hours a week is plenty of study time for just about everyone. And if you're just starting the course this week, you might want to bump it to 25, but really 20 hours a week is going to be enough to get you there if you're following the program. If you're a photo reader, you're obviously able to get through the reading in 15 or 20 minutes instead of 3 hours or 8 hours. And then you're using some of that savings time for your mind maps. If you're using bar maps, you're going to be able to speed that up even a bit further. But the point is, that's plenty of hours. Here's where I think students get into trouble. In that fear of missing out, you end up doing more questions and you get freaked out. And then you say, oh my God, I'm not doing enough. And so you need to put in more time. And so you get into this cycle of running faster and faster. And I think that is problematic. So I would say to this student, stop doing the outside questions. You don't need them. There's 2,300 questions in this course, along with answer explanations. Follow the study outline we've given you and set up 20 to 25 hours a week and you'll be fine. Now, this student went on to say that what they did is they went to an attorney that they work with to get more advice. You get the fear of missing out idea, right? I didn't get enough here. I don't like this. I'm going to get this. I'm going to add this. Then I'm going to go ask for advice. And I understand that's all perfectly normal. I'm not trying to put this student down. I'm just describing what I think a lot of people go through. This attorney, who I doubt if they teach the bar, what they said was do a simulated bar exam. This is not the time to do a simulated bar exam. That's a complete waste of your time and energy. You should be learning the underlying law before you get into a simulated exam. And then the student didn't do well on the simulated exam, and guess what happened? They started to freak out. Oh my God, it's going bad. Yeah, if we wanted to freak you out, we'd all have you take a simulated exam right now, and most of you would fail. That's just the reality. You'll be fine when we get there. follow the order of courses and the order of lessons that you see in the study guide. It actually works. And if you're in the course and you're just following that along, we'll get you to plenty of simulated exams. But don't take advice from people that don't know anything about the bar exam. You could, but it'll make you crazy. The student wrapped up by saying, do you think I'm starting too early to take a simulated? Yes. Should I go down on the number of questions I do a day? Yes. Should I follow the course outline? Yes. Okay. And then finally, this student, it was a great email. I mean, these are things that touch on so many people. They said, I noticed that last week you talked about mind maps. What's your take on me using them as a repeat taker? Oh, absolutely, you should be doing them. Whether you make your own mind maps or you use our Bar Maps product, you should absolutely be doing mind maps. I think it's one of the most powerful study tools you could possibly have. So absolutely think you should be doing that. So thanks for that question or questions. It was great. I hope I got through all of that for you. Next question, how many MBEs should we do daily and how many essays? You shouldn't do any of them daily. You should be following the course outline and the course structure, which will direct you when to do questions and how many to do and when to do essays. There was a study that we've talked about on, and we called it the 6 Keys to the Pass List. It's a free webinar. And in that, one of the things they discovered was this idea of the self-study cocktail and whether that helped people who had failed the exam pass. And what the study said empirically was it did not help. In fact, it hurt. And one of the reasons was that people were doing what this question implies, that somehow there's a fixed magic number of questions you should do daily. And if you just do enough questions, you're going to be successful. I want to remind you that the core of this course is built on the idea of repetition, which comes from reading lectures, then questions, then going away and then coming back and doing questions. So again, follow the structure of the course, and I think it will be helpful for you. All right, next question. How do you dissect a long fact pattern in 90 seconds on the MBE for areas like contracts, real property, and con law? And I could say that would be true for every subject, right? There are long fact patterns everywhere. When you've got a long fact pattern, you don't need to dissect it. What you need to do is react to it. Read it intuitively, read for the entire piece, and then reach your stated conclusion. Then look at your answer choices, then select. You don't treat a long fact pattern any differently than a short fact pattern. And what I would recommend to you is to go back and look at the series that Megan and I did on the 10 toughest MBE questions ever. You'll find it in your course. And in those, we've taken some long fact patterns and we've shown you how we apply and work through those. You don't want to do anything differently. And I think that's part of what you're going to hear when I start talking later today about the Rule Against Perpetuities and about spousal privilege. You don't want to make it too complicated. You want to get the main ideas and then just respond. But this word dissect suggests that somehow you can hyperanalyze it. You can't do that, not in 90 seconds. And you don't want to do it. You just want to get the primary thrust of the question. You want to get the generalized answer in your brain and then select it. And if you can't find it, skip it and go on, or mark your default answer and go on. It's not worth any more points than the short fact pattern. So don't get tripped up that way. Great question, though. I appreciate it. So now what we're going to do, we've got about a half hour left. And against my better judgment, I'm going to try and explain some legal concepts that are brutal and to see what we can do there. The study questions that keep you awake. And what we did was to ask our students in the last week, send us some of the study questions that keep you awake substantively. Some of you sent some very specific questions. Some of you sent really broad questions. I will say that it's very difficult to answer a broad question, describe causation. It's tough to do. We need to be a little more specific than that. But I tried to take a couple of broad categories that I heard from a lot of students on, and I wanted to talk about what might work there in order to help you get a little more comfort when you're in these particular subjects. So today we're at least going to start with spousal privilege, and then we're going to go to look at Rule Against Perpetuities. I think for a lot of people, there are study questions that do just that. They keep us awake at night, and so we wanted to help you figure out what to do about that. The first one I said that I wanted to look at is the spousal privilege, and here's what the student wrote to me. Spousal privilege in a criminal case, when do you know how to answer this in an MBE? I'm not sure when you know how to answer it. If it's an MBE question that says it's a criminal case and there's a spouse, then I think you've got to get some idea of how to answer it, and that should tell you you're in a criminal case. And some of you might be saying, well, what difference does it make? And as you're going to see, criminal cases, spousal privilege is different than in civil cases. So what we did was to try and break this out. And I used the particular paradigm that I use when I'm trying to break down a difficult subject. The first question that I ask myself, and what I would suggest that you do, is to ask yourself, what is the rule? What is it that we want to know about this rule? And so here's the rule about spousal privilege. There are two very different privileges when we talk about spousal privilege. When a witness is asked to testify against his or her spouse or a former spouse, and the first is the right in criminal cases to prevent the spouse from testifying. So you are not talking about this privilege unless you have a criminal case. And so that's where I think the first part of that student's question becomes important. We want to be sure that we're in a criminal case before we start applying this rule. But the first rule is that there is an opportunity to prevent a spouse from testifying. That's the simple rule, right? So what's the difficulty? Let's look at it a little bit more and see what happens. The reason that it's important, and this is the second question I ask myself. So first question is, what's the rule? Second question, why is that rule important? I think it's important to understand the background of a rule in order to know how to apply it. And what we're looking at here is a criminal defendant wants to keep the spouse off the witness stand because it comes from the incompetency of a husband or wife in common law to testify where they were an interested party. This was a disqualification. In other words, the theory was you were incompetent to testify because you're obviously biased and you're a husband or a wife. Then over time, that common law incompetency was transformed into a privilege. And when we've got a privilege, then we have a right to exercise it. But now it's going from automatic disqualification into something called a privilege. So where does the privilege exist? It's the privilege of one spouse to keep the other from testifying under any circumstances in a criminal case. And the reason for it then ultimately was based on a rationale that it would foster marital harmony. Now, I haven't seen a lot of criminal defendants that have marital harmony, but that was the idea. That was the fiction. So understand that what we're trying to do, the reason for this rule of spousal privilege is that we really don't want a biased witness testifying, and it now becomes embedded into our rules of evidence under the theory that we want to create marital harmony. Okay, so first question, what's the rule? Second question, why is it important? Third question, the one that you probably wanted to know, how do you apply it? There's two ways to apply this rule. The first is that the right to refuse to testify exists with the witness spouse. Now that's important, and that screws up a lot of people. The spouse who's the criminal defendant does not have the right to keep their spouse off the stand. This is the wrong answer that comes up over and over again. The right to refuse to testify belongs with the witness spouse. So I often think of this in terms of The Sopranos. Tony Soprano doesn't want Carmela to testify against him, and Carmela's mad at him. Carmela can get up and testify against him. He doesn't have any way to keep her off the stand, except that he's a soprano and who knows what he'd do. But you understand, the power doesn't rest with the criminal defendant, it rests with the witnessing spouse. And the second thing that you've got to know how to apply is that there has to be a marriage relationship at the time of the trial. Now, that's a big one. And a lot of times what the bar examiners do is they'll give you a situation in which the witness spouse has decided that they want to testify and the criminal defendant doesn't want them to testify. And you're thinking, okay, they can testify because they've got the right, but there's not a marriage relationship. So it doesn't matter. If you're not married, there's no marital privilege. So Tony and Carmela have to still be married at the time that she's going to testify. And that's the point that you want to keep in mind. So those two rules about how you apply it are really what operate most of the questions on criminal law spousal privilege. Now, sometimes when you want to go deeper, you ask yourself, all right, if I know how to apply the rule, are there times when the rule doesn't apply? In other words, when is it inapplicable? These are the exceptions. And what I find most often is that it's at the exception level that people get caught up and they find the rules, whatever subject it's in, to be too complicated. You can answer probably 75 to 90% of the questions in the subject with the first three questions I asked. What's the rule? Why is it important? And how do you apply it? There is a small percentage of these questions, however, in which there's going to be an exception. So at least we want to talk about those, but don't fixate on them. Don't spend a disproportionate amount of your time trying to study them. Just be aware of them and photo read them or put them into your mind maps, have a deeper knowledge of them so that if something comes up in the fact pattern, it will activate you to say, woo, maybe that doesn't apply. So let's look at it. There are 6 exceptions. The first is if the offered evidence is not communication. In other words, there was no attempt to send any kind of a message. So something happened. It wasn't a communication. The spouses did something. They held hands, but it wasn't kind of communication. They weren't trying to send a message. There wasn't anything that happened that was a message. I don't know what that would be, but that's an exception. The second is if the parties were not married at the time of the communication. Now, remember, we talked about the inapplicability about the marriage relationship at the time of trial. But in the same way, if the parties were not married when the communication took place, and let's say they got married later, it doesn't matter. Spousal privilege is not available. You have to be married at the time of the communication. The third way that spousal privilege doesn't apply is if the conversation took place in front of someone who is old enough to understand it. So often what the examiners do is they say that a conversation between husband and wife took place in front of an investigator or a paralegal or someone that doesn't have legal privilege necessarily, or maybe in front of their 22-year-old daughter. That's someone that's old enough to understand it. It's not a confidential conversation. So it has to be confidential. This one should be obvious. If the person objecting to the communication is not one of the spouses, Tony's mob boss says, hey, I don't want Carmela to talk. Doesn't count. It's only one of the spouses. What if the spouses are suing each other, divorce case? Now, can we claim a spousal privilege? And the answer is no, you can't. And of course, remember, if that situation is occurring, we're not in a criminal case anymore. We're in a civil case, so it wouldn't apply at all. And then finally, if the party claiming the privilege has already testified about the conversation. So we testified in deposition, but now I don't want to testify in the trial. We would say that deposition conversation created a waiver, and so there is no privilege. All right. We had a question here. Amanda's asking about when you're talking about spousal privilege, and it says that you don't get spousal privilege if you're suing. What about if you create a crime against the spouse or the children? In that case, the spouse or the children, if they're the victims, they could certainly testify. There's no privilege with respect to children. There's no spousal privilege with children. If you created a crime against the spouse, can they testify? Absolutely. Because remember, the rule is that the testifying witness, the spouse, always has the right to testify. So that's spousal privilege. Now, could you write more about it? Could you say more about it? Of course, but this is the core of it. And I really want to emphasize the key here is to stay in the core. Look at the rule, look at the history of the rule, and then how do you apply it? If you do that, then you really don't have to spend much time on the exceptions. Now we're ready to get into my least favorite topic probably of all time, but the one that gets asked the most, which is the rule against perpetuities. And I got a bunch of questions about it, but I thought this one was pretty well phrased. This student said, I really don't understand how to apply the rule against perpetuities. I memorized the rule itself, and I think everyone who's gone to law school can recite it, but I still have trouble applying it. No kidding. It is very difficult. And the rule against perpetuities creates all kinds of challenges for people. And I think it's important to have the concept, but also not to get too far into the weeds here. So I want to now show you with this mind map. And we've actually created this mind map for you in our Bar Maps product. You'll find it in the property section. You can click into that and download it. But I thought it would be helpful to show you a mind map specifically on the rule against perpetuity. Okay, this is our rule against perpetuities mind map. And I want to just start down here, the big picture, if you will. And I know that none of you can read any of those words, but what I want you to see is there's a lot of stuff here. If you get into this mind map, you can start expanding it and working with it. But I'm going to focus on some key items here that I think will help you at least get a sense of it. So we're going to zoom back in here and look at how we did this. And I put a thumbs up there for the rule against perpetuities because I love it so much. All right. I'm trying to change my attitude about this. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to identify the rule itself. And that's what you see up here in red. And the rule is that no interest is good unless it must vest, if at all, no later than 21 years after some life in being at the creation of the interest. Now, that's the rule. It's important to understand or to have that rule. But as we're going to see, there's a lot of pieces to that. But again, using the same methodology that we talked about with the privilege, I wanted to look at the purpose of the rule. And the basic purpose of the rule, as you see here, is to prevent title from being tied up by uncertain future interests for an extended period of time. I think sometimes with the rule against perpetuities, we get into the weeds so much that we forget what it's there to do. And therefore, we can miss obvious answers, or we use the rule against perpetuities as an answer when it probably shouldn't be. Remember that it's really there. The rule exists so that property isn't tied up for an indefinite period of time to an uncertain interest. Because then what do? Who owns it? What happens? So the uncertainty and the extended periods of time are important. Now, the other piece to remember about this is that it applies only to a non-reversionary future interest. And I know that when we start using terms like non-reversionary future interest, your eyes glaze over. So how do we define that? Well, really, it's a future interest in someone other than a grantor who would have a remainder interest or an executory interest. So if it can't revert back and it's a future interest, then the rule against perpetuities applies. But if the grant is going to go back to the original grantor, there's no rule against perpetuities problem. Or if there's an executory interest, it's not going to go into a rule against perpetuities problem. And therefore, you can exclude that answer whenever you see those situations. And I would tell you that about 10 to 15% of the questions I've looked at in this subject are just that. And it's the obvious wrong answer, but because we see RAP, we freak out and we start thinking, oh my God, it's got to be the answer. In some of the cases, it's clearly not the answer, and you can eliminate it very easily. All right, with that in mind, the second piece of my mind map was the same thing we did previously, which was how do we apply this rule that we've got? We've identified it, but how do we apply it? And here we've got a series of different pieces of application. I think there are 5. Some of them are simple and some not. The first application of the rule is that a vested remainder never violates the rule. That's pretty easy. If it's vested, it doesn't violate the rule. So if you're looking at a problem and it says there's a vested remainder, or you see that there's a vested remainder, RAP is never going to apply. So again, the ability to exclude it is very important. Secondly, the application of the rule is that the rule period begins with the creation of the interest. So if we're now trying to actually use the rule, we have to begin with some definitions. And the first definition is creation of the interest. So you have to see when the interest is actually being created. Simple enough at that point. Now, once you have that creation of the interest, the starting point, you then determine whether there are any lives in being that can serve to extend the period of time that's allowed by the rule. So we start with the creation. Then we say, what are the lives in being at this point? And obviously, there's a lot to go into what those lives in being are, but that's the first level of analysis. And you want to just look. If there aren't any lives in being, then obviously we've got a problem. Now, if we have a starting point and we say there are some lives in being, I don't know if they're good or not, but they're lives in being, the next part of the application of the rule is that the future interest that we're looking at, this future interest that's going to vest, has to vest within 21 years of the creation of the interest or at the end of the measuring lives. So it's either got to vest in 21 years or at the end of the measuring lives, if there are any. If there aren't any measuring lives, we got a problem, right? At that point, it's going to fail the rule against perpetuities. And then the final piece of the application is that when you create the interest, if there's any possibility that the interest is not going to vest during that rule period, then the interest is void, okay? Even if the possibility is really weird, highly unlikely, if there's any possibility that the interest can't vest, then you say, yeah, you violated the rule against perpetuities and the interest will not vest. Now, if you can just learn those 5 rules, you will get most rule against perpetuities questions correct. I am absolutely certain of that. The problem is everybody learns those 5 rules and then they go on to this other stuff and they get completely bogged down in the weeds. So here's what I did with the mind map. There are some examples where you violate the rule against perpetuities. And you heard me talk about them in the lectures. You've read them in the outlines. You've done some questions, but I'll just give you the titles and you'll know it. The fertile octogenarian rule, love that. The unborn widow rule, the administrative contingency, or an age limitation that's greater than 21 years. And you will find examples in your outlines from us of all of those things. But here's my point. You don't need to spend a long time studying those. If you see a fertile octogenarian, guess what? It violates the rule. If you see an unborn widow, it violates the rule. You don't have to go into a lot of detail. And so I think people spend too much time in this orange section down here. What I just said to you is just about everything you need to know in order to apply it for a bar exam question. All right, having done that, what happens next? You ask yourself, what's the rule's effect on any interest or conveyance? In other words, what's going to happen if we have to use the rule? And here it's actually fairly straightforward. If it's not certain that there's a non-reversionary interest that'll vest within 21 years from the end of the life in being at the time of the creation of the interest, remember that's what we just talked about up here, then what happens? The interest is void and you strike. That's the effect of the rule. So if you've ever wondered, I've applied the rule and they violated the rule, what's it mean? This is what it means. You make it void and you strike it from the granting instrument. So that's all it means. You go back and you say, nope, that conveyance is not going to be valid. Now, there are some special applications and modifications of the rule. Things like class gifts or having severable alternative contingencies or charities to charities. How many questions on the bar exam go into this? 1 out of 100 maybe. Very limited. So I don't think you have to spend a whole lot of time on it. It's in your materials, but I wouldn't spend time there. And then the final section of this has to do with alienability, descendability, and divisibility. Who wrote this? Oh, I did. Okay, so what that means is all future interests, first of all, can be alienated, right? They're all alienable. And the rule against perpetuities applies to preemptive rights or rights of first refusal. So if it's a contract or a covenant, that's not a condition on the estate. So I can still alienate my future interests, and the rule against perpetuities only applies to preemptive rights or rights of first refusal. And then we've got some additional examples of that. I would just use this example here. The kind of grant you might see in a question would say, a grant to A, so long as before he sells the property, he shall offer the property to the grantor at the market price. And if he does not, then to B's future interest is going to be a violation of the rule against perpetuities, because what's going to happen here, it's a preemptive right. It's retained by the grantor to have returned the granted property. And therefore, in that situation, it's going to be a violation of the rule. All right. Now, I know you were expecting something more dramatic and complicated and crazy than this, but I want to just go back to remind you that if you have the basics of the rule and you have the application of the rule, then really these exceptions that come up here in these smaller pieces are relatively minimal, and you don't need to spend quite so much time on them and in terms of learning them or using them. That's the rule against perpetuities. You will find that now in your bar maps in property under ownership. There is a link that takes you into this particular mind map, and you can use that and set it up that way. I hope that's helpful. I hope that these mind maps will be helpful for you. If you don't want to do mind maps, that's why I wanted to show you the privilege in a different structure. So if you're not a mind mapper, you could figure out how to set that up. But when there's a problem that's giving you great difficulty, use that same methodology. What's the rule? What's the reason for the rule? How does it apply? What are the exceptions? If you've got that in broad terms, I think you're going to be good on almost everything. All right. I hope everybody is doing well with their studies. I hope that you're able to quiet the mental mitote, the chaos in your brain, and slow it down and quiet it down, and just continue to move forward. I know there's a lot going on. There's a lot in the world. There's a lot with COVID. There's a lot with the bar exam. There's a lot with the holidays. But try to stay focused and make sure that you're following the study plan and working through it. We'll come back next week. We'll pick up with Double Jeopardy, and we'll pick up a few other topics. If you have something you want me to address, go ahead and send it. I probably won't get to all of them, but send them in. And when Megan gets back, we'll continue doing this if you think it's helpful. And I hope it is. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. I hope everybody stays healthy and safe. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for listening and watching the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at celebrationbarreview.com.